Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Complete Victory, Saratoga and the American Revolution, by Kevin Weddle, narrated by Paul Heitsch. Editor's Note: most historians of the American War for Independence agree that Saratoga was a pivotal moment in that long struggle. The victory of American citizen soldiers and the surrender of an entire British army caused Europe's leading military power to intervene in support of the American cause. When France entered the war, other European states followed. The fighting spread from America to Europe, Africa, and Asia. A colonial rebellion became a world war. Great Britain suffered the worst defeat in its modern history, and the new United States won their independence. That understanding of Saratoga's importance is widely shared by scholars, but precisely how and why it happened is a more difficult and complex question. Saratoga was not a single battle. It came as the climax of a long campaign, after many other events that drew in a diversity of American Continentals, state militia, British regulars, Canadian troops, German mercenaries, and Indian warriors. Their commanders had different traditions of leadership, and the many men who served with them had profoundly different ideas of why they were there. These events have drawn the attention of Kevin Weddle, an historian who has distinguished himself in two professional careers. He is a graduate of West Point, who, like other leading graduates of that great institution, joined the Army Corps of Engineers. His long military career has spanned a broad range of assignments, including as battalion commander, as well as service in Operations Desert Storm and Enduring Freedom. At the same time, Weddle actively pursued another career as a professional historian. He earned a doctorate in American history at Princeton, published a major dissertation on the American Civil War, and produced other important works of scholarship. And he brought his two professional careers together as a professor at the Army War College, where he rapidly rose to become its deputy dean. We invited Weddle to contribute a volume to the Pivotal Moments in American History series at Oxford on a subject of his own choosing. He selected the Saratoga campaign, which had first drawn his attention when he began to study it as a cadet. His continuing interest in the campaign centered on problems of leadership. For many years, the study of leaders had been at the heart of much historical scholarship. More recent generations of scholars have shifted their primary inquiries to other questions of high importance in social, economic, demographic, cultural, and intellectual history. Much was gained by this enlargement of historical research, but something important has been lost. In recent years, we in the United States have suffered a decline in the quality of leadership in high elective offices in our American Republic. The primary cause is not only a pattern of failure in our leaders themselves, but in those of us who choose them. Our culture, on many levels, has tended to move away from the vital task of preparing Americans for their primary civic responsibilities in the choice of those who should lead in a free and open society. In consequence, historians are returning to the study of leadership. Weddle's book on Saratoga centers not merely on a few at the top. It is broadly conceived to include a diversity of people who functioned in many prominent roles in a world historical event, and who made a difference, both positive and negative, in its outcome. It studies a broad array of leaders, senior and junior, civilian and military, who functioned in the 13 American states, in Britain's constitutional monarchy, in French and British Canada, in German professional forces, and within American Indian nations. Some have given rise to an historical literature that is large and often deeply divided. Weddle, who commands a large range of primary and secondary materials and whose inquiries draw on his own personal experience and background, comes to his own balanced conclusions. His inquiries combine the precise thinking of a professional soldier with a scholar's concern for evidence. At the same time, he has written a fluent, graceful, and engaging book that brings out the drama of pivotal moments. The Saratoga campaign occurred in a flow of events that began in 1775 and continued to 1777 and beyond. Each of its battles featured different sets of commanding officers and supporting leaders. Weddle's book takes the form of a braided narrative, centering on several sequences of leaders who made choices that made a difference in the world. Military history can be confusing to the non-professional reader, especially when it involves so many characters operating over such a wide geographic area. Weddle's skill keeps the story of Saratoga moving forward with a clarity that conquers confusion. More than any other book on its subject, Weddle's narrative studies the central role of an American leader who was not present on the field at Saratoga, George Washington, who was learning by trial and error to master his role as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army and as a leader in the American cause. Washington began with a near-fatal failure to perceive the vital importance of events on the distant northern frontier. Then, through a process of learning and growth, he worked constructively with individual military commanders and civilian leaders in the Saratoga campaign, sending some of his most able officers and best fighting units from his own forces. Weddle reconstructs a pattern of change and growth in the man and the event. Altogether, it enlarges and refines our understanding of the man, the event, and problems of leadership in a long sequence of critical moments. Weddle does something similar for major leaders on every side and is always very careful, creative, and independent in his judgments. In that way, he makes fresh and original contributions to our understanding of a number of individual leaders on the American side, including Sinclair at Ticonderoga, Gansevoort at Stanwix, Herkimer at Oriskany, Stark at Bennington, Morgan and Dearborn at Freeman's Farm, Gates and Learned and Arnold at Bemis Heights, and British, Hessian, Canadian, and American Indian leaders in equal measure. In this book, Weddle reflects on general models of leadership, such as Bernard Montgomery's idea of grip, and through it all, he also gives particular attention to forms of effective leadership in open systems. All of us can put his knowledge and judgment to work when we choose our own leaders, or when we find ourselves chosen to lead in a free society. David Hackett Fisher, James M. McPherson. Introduction. Fatal Ambition. The Queen's house was modest as royal palaces went in 18th century England. In 1761, King George III purchased the former country home of the Duke of Buckingham for his young wife, Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. This unpretentious retreat for the royal family, later expanded substantially, would one day be known as Buckingham Palace. A family home, only a few steps from St. James Palace, the official royal residence, the Queen's house provided the King and Queen with some respite from their official duties. It was there, in late August 1777, that the King received a message. It so thrilled him that he burst into his wife's chambers, waving the paper in the air, exclaiming, "I have beat them! I have beat the Americans!" The message informed His Majesty that British Lieutenant General John Burgoyne had captured Fort Ticonderoga, the strategically important American fortress located on the southern narrows of Lake Champlain. Achieved with minimal casualties, the victory convinced the king and his ministers that the military strategy they had put in place that spring was unfolding according to plan. In October 1777, 2 months after the king's impromptu celebration and 3 months after taking Ticonderoga, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of almost 6,000 officers and men to an American force of Continental soldiers and militia under the command of Major General Horatio Gates at a place called Saratoga. Only 1 year earlier, the American Revolution looked to be on its last legs. The Americans had been forced out of New York, and the rebel army was slowly evaporating. However, the Americans were able to stave off their seemingly inevitable defeat by winning at Trenton and Princeton in late 1776 and early 1777. After these surprising setbacks, the British were determined to end the war once and for all. They devised a complicated plan. 3 different British armies would converge on Albany, New York, take control of the Hudson River, and split the newly self-proclaimed independent nation in 2. Burgoyne would command the army from Canada. The main army, under the British Commander-in-Chief General Sir William Howe, was to first seize Philadelphia, then support Burgoyne by moving up the Hudson. The strategy miscarried badly. When word of Burgoyne's surrender reached London on the evening of December 2, 1777, the country was stunned. Everyone had been led to believe that victory over the upstart American colonists was just around the corner. Politicians, newspapers, and the public clamored for blame to be assigned. Opposition members in Parliament demanded the resignation of key ministers. Senior military officers were embarrassed. The American victory at Saratoga was a major military setback for the British. It profoundly affected the course of events over the next 5 years, not least because it led directly to France's decision to enter the war on the Patriot side, which changed the entire character of the American Revolution from a colonial rebellion to a world war. Given that the focus of this series about pivotal moments in American history is on historical contingency, it would be unthinkable to omit the Saratoga campaign. The planning and execution of the campaign are replete with critical decisions by leaders on both sides, and chance played a major role, as it always does in war. This book covers the entire campaign in all its complexity, including its origins, execution, and aftermath, and a more dramatic and consequential American story is hard to find. I first became interested in the American Revolution and the Saratoga campaign while a cadet at the United States Military Academy at West Point, located 130 miles south of the main battlefield. Throughout a long military career, I have been fortunate to lead hundreds of staff rides and battlefield tours to sites in the United States and Europe, ranging from the Battle of Agincourt to Saratoga to Waterloo to Gettysburg to Gallipoli to the D-Day landings in Normandy. These trips, combined with 2 combat deployments, command of a battalion, and teaching posts at West Point and the U.S. Army War College, sharpened my interest in leadership and military strategy, which are the 2 major themes that run through this book. Essential to understanding the Saratoga campaign's outcome is an appreciation of the origins of the strategy that drove the military operations and of the leaders whose decisions drove the British and American forces to their final clashes along the Hudson River. Who was to blame for Britain's ignominious defeat? Most have assigned the lion's share of the responsibility to Lord George Germain, Secretary of State for the Colonies and the minister responsible for British military operations in North America. Howe is also blamed for wasting time and resources on other campaigns when he should have been assisting the army from Canada. Yet I argue that it was the strategy itself that was ultimately responsible. The foundations for the British defeat at Saratoga were laid in London, New York, and Quebec, where the strategy was devised in the winter and spring of 1777. Indeed, responsibility for the loss at Saratoga spreads wide. Germain tried to micromanage the war from a continent away and failed to ensure that all British commanders in North America, especially Burgoyne and Howe, coordinated their efforts. By the summer of 1777, Howe understood that the only way to win the war was to destroy the American army under the command of General George Washington. However, he did not move quickly or synchronize his actions with those of Burgoyne's army to make this happen. Finally, Burgoyne, the man who surrendered to Gates, proved to be simply out of his depth. Despite being an experienced and popular commander, Burgoyne never understood until it was too late just how challenging the American environment would be for moving and supplying and fighting with a large European army. Despite their ultimate victory, the Americans were not immune to the failures of leadership during the Saratoga campaign. Major General Arthur Sinclair, commanding Fort Ticonderoga, committed a series of blunders that led directly to the fortress's evacuation and ensured that Burgoyne's invasion got off to a fast start with a major success. For the most part, Major General Philip Schuyler, commander of the so-called Northern Department, made decisions that helped lay the groundwork for ultimate American success. Still, his wildly pessimistic reports to Congress and General Washington caused his superiors to lose confidence in his ability to stem Burgoyne's seemingly inexorable advance south toward Albany. Schuyler's replacement was Horatio Gates, who built on the foundation that Schuyler had already laid. Later in the war, events would demonstrate just how fortunate Gates had been in August 1777 to inherit a situation in which his talents meshed with the circumstances. Major General Benjamin Lincoln, Gates' second-in-command late in the campaign, proved invaluable to his superiors in handling the sometimes unreliable militia units from the New England states and in the substantive reinforcement of the Northern Army when it mattered the most. The Americans also had a depth of strong leadership in many outstanding field officers and junior general officers, who performed admirably during the campaign. Brigadier General John Stark led his troops to victory at the Battle of Bennington, an engagement that proved the beginning of the end for Burgoyne and his army. Though heavily outnumbered, Colonel Peter Gansevoort successfully defended Fort Stanwix. Colonel Daniel Morgan led his riflemen at the Battle of Freeman's Farm and the Battle of Bemis Heights. All of these American senior leaders, and many more besides, contributed to the victory at Saratoga. Perhaps the most dynamic combat leader on either side was Major General Benedict Arnold. From the moment he joined the Northern Army, he made a difference, helping to restore morale, managing militia, conducting reconnaissance missions and raids, and personally leading the final assault at the Battle of Bemis Heights. There is no doubt that Arnold's role was central to the American success at Saratoga, even though he was volatile and easily took offense. But the advantages Gates derived from having Arnold as one of his combat commanders far outweighed the disadvantages. The Americans in the Northern Department were also fortunate that their commander-in-chief was George Washington, even though he was more than 200 miles away to the south and distracted by the challenge of facing Howe's main British army. Washington underestimated the threat to and the readiness of the Northern Department in the winter and spring of 1777. Nonetheless, he more than made up for his earlier inattention to the theater after the loss of Ticonderoga in July. Washington patiently counseled and mentored the anxious Schuyler and provided sound advice. He also appealed to New England governors and assemblies to muster and dispatch militia forces to join the Northern Army, hurried significant reinforcements northward, and, perhaps most importantly, assigned Benedict Arnold and Benjamin Lincoln to report to Schuyler. Washington's contributions to the Saratoga campaign are generally glossed over, but they were essential for American victory. Washington could have neglected or even ignored the Northern Army while he faced General Howe, but he did not. He continued setting priorities and allocating his resources accordingly. While preparing one of my Army War College courses, I encountered British Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery's notion of grip, a term he used to describe a commander who was able to manage a battle or campaign by personally scrutinizing and supervising all elements of a military operation. These attributes are essential elements of leadership. However, I wanted to take the concept a step farther. For this book, I have expanded on Montgomery's definition of grip to include the ability to anticipate how operations might unfold and how to react to change, something closer to what Karl von Clausewitz called genius. Grip results when superior leadership combines with experience and expertise. According to my formulation, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Lord Nelson, Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, and, closer to Montgomery's own time, General George Patton, all had grip in their ability to sense how a battle or maneuver was unfolding, how the overall engagement was playing out, and when to take the right action, even in uncertain environments and in the absence of critical information. Montgomery's definition mainly concerned tactical actions on the battlefield. My concept of grip can equally be applied at the operational and strategic levels of war. Simply put, the Saratoga campaign turned out the way it did because American leaders displayed more grip at all levels of war than their British counterparts. In war, geography is everything. The Saratoga campaign was epic in both its scope and its impact. Few operations in American history, with exceptions in the Civil War and World War II, took place over such vast distances in such forbidding terrain. It ranged across thousands of square miles and involved dozens of separate battles, engagements, sieges, and maneuvers, some relatively minor, but others pivotal. To understand this reality and make sense of a very complex campaign, I spent many days walking the sites. The beauty of the Lake Champlain region and the Mohawk River Valley in central and western New York made this a very pleasurable experience. It also drove home just how challenging it would have been for 18th century armies to manage operations over such rugged terrain. The experience increased the respect I already had for those on both sides who marched through these woods, across these rivers and creeks, and over these hills and mountains from June through October 1777. Native Americans played a major role in the Saratoga campaign, and they participated on both sides of the conflict. I use the terms Native and Native American frequently in the book, but for the most part employ Indian or Indians, as most people, Indian and non-Indian, did at the time. I have relied on many earlier works on the Saratoga campaign, including those by Hoffman, Nickerson, John Elting, Richard Ketchum, Brendan Morrissey, John Luzader, and others. This book benefits from, and I hope complements theirs, while at the same time I have made my own interpretations and conclusions. As much as possible, I have tried to let the participants tell the story, and have also addressed some errors and misunderstandings about the operation that sometimes have made for a good story, if not for good history. Saratoga changed the American Revolution. The campaign's outcome reverberated everywhere, in Quebec, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, York, London, and Paris. It has become almost a cliché to describe Saratoga as a turning point in the war, but this should not diminish the fact that Saratoga was decisive. It was, as one of the campaign's participants labeled it, the complete victory. Chapter 1. Opening Moves. When the Royal Navy frigate HMS Cerberus arrived in Boston Harbor on May 25, 1775, she was carrying 3 British Army Major Generals, William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne. One London wit seized on the occasion to create one of the most memorable rhymes of the war. Behold the Cerberus, the Atlantic plow, her precious cargo, Burgoyne, Clinton, Howe. Bow, wow, wow. Seldom had so much military experience and expertise been concentrated in one appropriately named vessel. Only 2 years after they arrived in America, all 3 would be involved in arguably the most significant campaign of the American Revolution. They were sent from England to reinforce a British army trying to control the increasingly unruly colonists in Massachusetts and its neighboring provinces. War had already broken out in Lexington and Concord, with the retreat of British soldiers back into Boston, and a ragtag American army was now besieging the city. Howe commanded 4,000 reinforcements, intended to bring General Thomas Gage's small army there up to a total of about 9,000 redcoats, and, although the senior general among the three, was assigned to serve as Gage's second-in-command. To break the siege, the generals conducted a frontal assault on entrenched American positions on Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill on June 17, 1775. The attack was led by Howe, with Clinton in a supporting role. Howe's action resulted in a Pyrrhic victory. Clinton reportedly wrote after the battle that Bunker Hill was a dear-bought victory. Another such would have ruined us. Howe, writing to another officer, called the battle "this unhappy day," and "I freely confess to you, when I look at the consequences of it, in the loss of so many brave officers, I do it with horror." Howe soon replaced the unfortunate Gage and became the commander-in-chief of the British Army in America in October 1775. Howe's counterpart, George Washington, was named the American commander-in-chief 3 days before Bunker Hill, arrived in Boston several weeks after the battle. The fledgling Continental Army was formed by an act of Congress on June 14, 1775. The day before Washington received his commission. 2 weeks later, Congress directed that the state militias be incorporated into the Continental Army. After Bunker Hill, both sides settled down to a siege that lasted for months. While the two sides eyed each other from their fortifications, General Howe, promoted to full general in January 1776, as befitted his position as commander-in-chief, delayed conducting any major operations, and was content to hunker down in the city. Burgoyne, who was unable to secure a meaningful position in the army at Boston, returned to Britain to seek new opportunities. While the siege of Boston dragged on, Clinton, now Howe's second-in-command, became increasingly disenchanted with his boss, and the feeling was mutual. Clinton thought that a part of his job was to provide military advice and counsel to the commander-in-chief. Howe did not see it that way. He believed Clinton should accomplish the tasks assigned to him and keep his mouth shut. Where Clinton was outspoken, if introverted, Howe was amiable and easygoing. It was almost inevitable that they would clash, and they were simply unable to reach a meeting of minds, especially involving the proper strategy to fight the Americans. The relationship between Howe and Clinton was emblematic of one of the major problems facing the British in America: disagreements among the senior political and military leadership. The siege of Boston finally ended in the midwinter of 1776. The Americans were able to mount heavy cannon dragged overland from Fort Ticonderoga, which had been seized without difficulty by patriots under Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold on May 10, 1775, under the supervision of Colonel Henry Knox. They placed the artillery on Dorchester Heights, overlooking the town and the harbor. Although Howe thought about attacking the heights, memories of Bunker Hill were fresh in his mind, and he decided to evacuate Boston. On March 17, 1776, British troops and their equipment were embarked on ships and sailed for Halifax, Nova Scotia. By the end of March, there were no British troops in the American colonies. Howe's frustration with Clinton, newly promoted to lieutenant general, came to a head in January 1776, when the commander-in-chief sent his second-in-command on an expedition to the southern colonies to explore possible military operations in North or South Carolina. Most British leaders thought that the southern colonies were home to large numbers of loyalists who were being oppressed by the rebels. Supported by the presence of British troops, they would be instrumental in putting down the rebellion and securing territory. Howe both wanted to explore this opportunity and rid himself of his talented but annoying subordinate, at least for a while. Further, Howe sought to take advantage of the unsurpassed mobility that the Royal Navy gave him. Howe's older brother, Vice Admiral Lord Richard Howe, was the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?